Good morning, and welcome to Citizens Climate Lobby's very first Catholic conference. My name is John Clark, and I'm Regional Coordinator for the Appalachia region of CCL, and I'm talking with you from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I'm one of the conference organizers, along with CCL's Catholic Action Team. I'm so excited to tell you we have folks registered for this conference from 46 states in the United States, and at least 16 different countries, including Argentina, Australia, Canada, Colombia, Gambia, Great Britain, Georgia, Hungary, Italy, Ivory Coast, Kenya, Liberia, Mexico, Pakistan, Sierra Leone, and South Africa. A special welcome to you if you're joining us from outside of the United States. A couple of housekeeping items. First, I'd like to put a link to a document we call the Zoom line cheat sheet in the chat. You should have also received this cheat sheet in the email reminder you received this morning. This document gives you all the session times along with the name of the session and the Zoom links you can use to join the session. The line you're on now is the main plenary line and will be where most of the sessions happen today. The breakout sessions at 1:25 and 2:25 Eastern Time will be held on two separate lines, and you can use the Zoom cheat sheet to find the links to click on to join those sessions later. After those breakouts, we'll gather back on this line for the ending sessions and close of the conference. Now I'd like to turn it over to Sister Elizabeth Brandreth, who will lead us in an opening prayer. Sister Elizabeth, are you ready for us?
Yes. Good morning. I invite you to listen to and pray with a beautiful prayer by Pope Francis, which appears at the end of Laudato Si. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor in the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen.
Thank you, Sister Elizabeth. Now I'd like to introduce you all to CCL's president, Madeleine Para, who will kick off our conference today. Madeleine, over to you.
Okay, thank you, John, and thank you for that prayer, Sister Elizabeth. And welcome, everybody. I'm Madeleine Para, president of Citizens Climate Lobby, and I am so pleased to be here with you. In my opening remarks, I want to welcome you, provide some background for this conference, and of course, introduce Bishop Stowe. Let me welcome you with some of Pope Francis's opening words in Laudato Si. He wrote, "The urgent challenge to protect our common home includes a concern to bring the whole human family together to seek a sustainable and integral development, for we know that things can change. The Creator does not abandon us. He never forsakes his loving plan or repents of having created us. Humanity still has the ability to work together in building our common home." I have to say that again. Humanity still has the ability to work together in building our common home. And then the Pope continues, "Here I want to recognize, encourage, and thank all those striving in countless ways to guarantee the protection of the home which we share. I thank you also, and I welcome you to this conference where we'll explore ways to work together, especially here in the United States, to achieve greater, swifter progress towards protecting our common home. As Pope Francis goes on to say, we need a conversation which includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affect us all. Now, everyone includes you. And although I can't see you here on Zoom, and I don't know many of you personally, I do believe that each of us, including you, is called to be here and to do our part. You're part of everyone, and you belong to our common home. So I hope that you'll find ways to express yourself today and after today, and add your voice and your hands to and your minds to the work that Pope Francis calls us to do. From Laudato Si again, all of us can cooperate as instruments of God through the care of creation, each according to his or her own culture, experience, involvements, and talents. So why, you might ask, is a secular organization called Citizens Climate Lobby holding a conference for and about Catholics? CCL is a fairly unusual organization in that we've always reached for people from all walks of life, all backgrounds, spiritual traditions, and political persuasions to work together on the climate problem. We actively look for people to join us who aren't typically seen as environmentalists, but are concerned about our beautiful planet. And we believe that the solutions will be stronger and smarter if we engage everyone in working on the problem, including those who aren't expected to engage. And in particular, we work to bring people in this country from both the right and the left politically to join efforts, because we can't move forward on the basis of division. We organize ourselves by community, by congressional district, and by common interest. There are chapters in every state, and there are national action teams for many groups, not limited to faith groups, but including Catholics, Jews, evangelicals, Unitarians, Buddhists, Mormons, Methodists, Quakers, and Presbyterians. And I did not list all our action teams. This conference is the undertaking of the dedicated volunteers in our National Catholic Action Team, with help from John Clark, who you've met, our regional coordinator for the Appalachian region of CCL. So I have to thank you, all of you, so much for giving us this delightful day and conference and bringing us together. So our work in CCL is done from a place of respecting the many efforts that are being undertaken around the world and in many different fields, while choosing to focus our organization on one very big and very important undertaking, persuading the United States Congress to lead by passing a strong price on carbon, which would ripple out through all parts of the economy and help other nations to follow suit. I'll come back to that. But first again, why a conference for Catholics as part of our efforts to reach the US Congress? Well, first of all, one of our core values is to work from a place of love and respect rather than anger. Our goal is to reach the hearts and minds of our members of Congress, and it is good to draw strength from our faith as we do that. We, for Yes, I Am a Catholic, are also a very large church, nearly a quarter of the United States population, and worldwide, of course. 27% of the members of the US Congress are Catholic. We think you can play a role in reaching their hearts and minds as fellow Catholics, and the breakout sessions during the conference will give you concrete ideas that fit your time budget for helping us to do that. So what is this price on carbon that we'd like Congress to enact? It's the single most powerful tool available to reduce America's carbon pollution, though many tools will be needed. Various forms of carbon pricing have been enacted around the world, and Pope Francis has said, carbon pricing is essential if humanity is to use the resources of creation wisely. A strong economy-wide price on carbon can reduce America's carbon pollution by 50% by 2030 and put us on track to reach net zero by 2050. A carbon tax becomes affordable for ordinary Americans when the money collected from fossil fuel companies is given as a dividend or carbon cashback payment to every American to spend with no restrictions. This protects low and middle income Americans who otherwise might not be able to afford the transition. A carbon price will also save 4.5 million American lives over the next 50 years by restoring clean air across the country. It will have a particular impact in communities of color, which have suffered the worst health impacts of burning fossil fuels. You can learn more about carbon pricing at the link that's either been or going to be put in the chat. There are several carbon pricing bills introduced in Congress currently. The one that CCL has worked the hardest on is called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It has just been reintroduced in Congress as HR 2307, HR 2307. It's grown to have 56 co-sponsors, and it's received over 2,000 endorsements from businesses, nonprofits, elected officials, faith leaders, and other community leaders across the country. You can find more information about it at energyinnovationact.org, which is also in the chat. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Catholic Climate Covenant have been supportive of this legislation, and we are so delighted to have Jose Aguto from the Catholic Climate Covenant as one of our speakers later today. Well, it's been just an amazing blessing in my life for me to have found Citizens Climate Lobby. Just a little about that. On Christmas Eve, back in 2009, I found a book on the coffee table at my mother's house called Storms of My Grandchildren by Dr. James Hansen. That was the pivotal point where I knew I was being called to change my life. Perhaps you'll enjoy knowing that my mother said, as she gave the book to me because she saw I was so absorbed in it, "God speaks to me in bookstores," she said, "and I can see that you need to take this book home with you, Madeleine." Well, when I eventually discovered CCL, or more accurately, when CCL eventually found me, I felt sure that I was meant to throw myself into that young organization with a big heart and an even bigger mission. And I've grown with the organization, and the organization has grown and grown and grown. And I have learned so much along the way. Sometimes it's felt like a very long 10 years, but my faith in God, my church, and in particular, the music and the members of the 1115 church choir that let me sing with them at Our Lady Queen of Peace, they helped to sustain me. I hope that this conference will prove to be a significant step on your own journey, however you're called to work on behalf of our common home. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Bishop Stowe. Bishop Stowe is the Bishop of Lexington, Kentucky, the Episcopal Advisor for the Catholic Committee of Appalachia, and Bishop President of Pax Christi USA. Last fall, Bishop Stowe spoke at a webinar on Catholic social teaching and political participation hosted by the Catholic Climate Covenant, and he made the case for why it is essential for Catholics to engage in politics. As reported in the National Catholic Reporter, he said, "I don't see how you can read the Gospels and come away thinking Jesus wasn't involved in politics." Okay. Bishop Stowe, this is a message that is near and dear to Citizens Climate Lobby. Lobbyists are often frowned upon, but we think citizen lobbyists are essential. We teach people how to talk to their elected officials, make presentations in their community, write letters to the editor, and engage at a high level in the politics of climate change. Again, we think citizen lobbyists are so essential. For those of you who are here, if you have questions for Bishop Stowe when his remarks are finished, you can put them into the Q&A, which you'll find the button at the bottom of your screen, and not into the chat, but use the Q&A. And Bishop Stowe, I just want to acknowledge that in addition to all the roles that you play that I listed earlier, I know you also have a wedding to preside over today and many people that you must care for and support. So thank you so very much for taking time to speak to us today.
I'm delighted to be with you. What a beautiful introduction to the whole conference, and I really applaud your work. And I'm going to be learning more myself about the carbon pricing initiative and be writing to our congressional representation as well. So thank you. It's a delight to be with you. Today is the 6th anniversary of the issuing of Laudato Si, the first encyclical on the environment. Although Pope Benedict XVI and even John Paul II had previously spoken about the centrality of care for creation, within our Catholic social teaching. Pope Francis, as he often does, has elevated this to another level. He has given it the highest form of teaching in the Catholic Church, and that is the form of an encyclical. And the way that he writes his encyclical is as engaging as the way that he speaks. It's inclusive. It reaches those on the peripheries as well as those in the center. It calls forth reflection. It calls forth action. And it really calls forth a conversion, which is probably the hardest piece of what he has to say. Today is also the feast of Saint Isidro, the farmer, Isidore the farmer, and Santa Maria de la Cabeza, his wife. They are people who remind us of the importance of returning to the land. And even though I'm involved with the Catholic Committee in Appalachia and the Bishop of Lexington, as Madeleine mentioned, I'm preparing for a wedding. I'm here in my old home in El Paso on a spot that used to be a cotton field. It used to be blessed on the feast of Saint Isidore the farmer every year. Thinking of Lexington, 40 of the 50 counties of my diocese are part of Appalachia. The beauty and richness of this area coexists with the consequences of repeated cycles of poverty from overdependence on extractive industries that are no longer viable. First, it was lumber, and for much longer, coal. I can celebrate the majestic beauty of the land where I live and the warmth and closeness of the Appalachian people. But I also have to acknowledge the devastation of opioid and heroin addiction, the long-term unemployment, the so-called brain drain and the loss of a younger generation, the long-term unemployment, and those who are forced to seek work outside the region. Compounded by the false promises and false excuses of politicians who decry the so-called war on coal, but have not done much to stimulate a more diverse economy that would include more people. When great numbers of people in our region believe that it is only the environmental regulations on the coal industry that have caused the loss of coal mining jobs, they are faced with the impossible choice between their own livelihood and the well-being and future of the planet. Scaling back environmental regulations, which are costly to implement, they are told, would bring back the coal mining jobs. False promises that are repeated during every major election year. This leads to either widespread denial of environmental degradation or forcing people into the impossible choice between the lesser of two evils: expanded mining with more jobs that pay living wages, or restoring the environment. Clearly, the choices don't seem fair. In different words, Pope Francis would say, why would you put the burden on the backs of the poor when the challenge and the resources that have been extracted from the land have benefited just a few of the wealthy? Pope Francis addresses the false choices which pit human beings against the environment and environmental preservation against human livelihood in that encyclical, Laudato Si. But as we know with Pope Francis, before he opens his mouth to speak or puts his pen to paper, Francis teaches us by example. And he regularly calls us to look to the periphery, to the margins, to the outcast. He is acutely aware of the observation of a liberation theologian that wherever you are on the periphery, you can always see the center. But the center, if it pays any attention at all, can only see one little portion of the periphery at a time. From his continuous attention to those on the margins and his invitation to us to be attentive, Pope Francis teaches us that the commandment, thou shalt not kill, must be expanded in our day to thou shalt not exclude, because in a globalized economy, exclusion is death. On the other hand, we know that a more participative economy, as well as more participative democracy, leads to the flourishing of life and the well-being of more people. We believe, and CCL certainly believes, that coming together, we can make a difference and impact on our environment we can create a more just society that is at the same time more sustainable. Starting with the original meaning of the word ecology in Laudato Si', Pope Francis refers to the earth as home, our common home. And he quotes the familial terminology used by Francis of Assisi, his namesake, as Sister Mother Earth. He says, our sister is hurting, has been plundered, is calling out. Human sin and violence are manifest in abuse of soil, water, air, and forms of life. We forget that Genesis tells us, in the beginning, we are made of the earth. He cites his predecessor's concern with the environment, going back all the way to St. John the 23rd, and he lists the company of scientists, philosophers, theologians, and civic groups among those who recognize the need to do something about the destruction of the planet. He quotes his friend, the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, who has called crimes against the natural world sins against ourselves and against God. Pope Francis doesn't claim to be original in connecting the plight of the vulnerable to the plight of the planet. He draws upon the example of St. Francis of Assisi, who lived joyfully and authentically while caring for the outcast and living in fraternity with all creation. St. Francis was in love with God's creatures, and St. Francis teaches us an openness to awe and wonder at God's creation, necessary ingredients in our appreciation and our work for the preservation of the environment. At the same time, St. Francis gives an example of living in healthy, mutual relationships, relationships of fraternity rather than dominance with creation. The Pope appeals for change from the whole human family in order to seek sustainable and integral development. He laments that ecological preservation efforts have been met with powerful opposition or indifference, denial, or with a blind confidence in merely technical solutions. In the encyclical, the Pope reviews the scientific research. Now, mind you, that's not an ordinary feature in papal encyclicals. He reviews the scientific research, the principles of Judeo-Christian tradition concerning the environment. He presents the roots and causes, humanly and relationally, and makes proposals for dialogue and international policy, offering guidelines for education, human and spiritual development. Throughout the encyclical, a connection between the poor and the fragility of the planet, the interconnectedness of everything, critiques of power and the abuse of power, and the proposal of a different lifestyle, a new lifestyle, will surface repeatedly. Pope Francis decries the loss of biodiversity. Loss of forests and woodlands means loss of species and more extinctions. A sober look, he says, shows that the degree of human intervention, often in the service of business interests and consumerism, is making our earth less rich and beautiful. Artificial products, he says, do not compete with natural beauty. Even when we are aware of the impact of a development project on soil, water, and air, the impact on biodiversity is often overlooked. This happens with the construction of roads, of plantations, and even the commercial exploitation of certain species without attention to the imbalance that is created. There are extremely high costs to environmental deterioration that just are not seen by those seeking a quick profit. The Pope discusses how human beings are affected by environmental destruction. Growth of congested cities without green spaces affects quality of life. Natural spaces have become increasingly privatized, and the growth of the past 2 centuries has not always led to an improvement of life, but has led to more social exclusion, inequitable distribution, and consumption of energy, social breakdown, increased violence and social aggression, drug trafficking, drug use, and the loss of identity. The omnipresence of media and the digital world is replacing wisdom and the capacity to think deeply and without noise and distractions, what he calls mental pollution. In contrast with this grim description of degradation, Pope Francis offers the gospel's vision of creation. All creation is linked by unseen bonds in a universal family, which neither limits the uniqueness of human beings nor divinizes the earth itself. We cannot have communion with creation if we lack tenderness and compassion for fellow human beings. Hearts authentically open to universal communion exclude nothing and no one. Peace, justice, and the preservation of creation are absolutely interconnected. The Pope notes that even unbelievers recognize the earth as a shared inheritance whose fruits are meant to benefit everyone. St. John Paul said that not only is private property not an absolute right, but also that private property has a social mortgage. Pope Francis goes on to say, doomsday predictions can no longer be met with irony or disdain. We may well be leaving to coming generations debris, desolation, and filth. The pace of consumption, waste, and environmental change has so stretched the planet's capacity that our contemporary lifestyle, unsustainable as it is, can only precipitate catastrophes such as those which now periodically occur in different areas of the world. The effects of the present imbalance can only be reduced by our decisive action here and now. We need to reflect on our accountability before those who will have to endure these dire consequences. Rampant individualism, he reminds us, the self-centered culture of instant gratification makes it very difficult to address the environmental challenge. Encyclical is a call to conversion, not just individual and communal conversion, but global conversion to a sustainable lifestyle, lived in interrelationship with humanity and all creation. The idea of carbon pricing is one very concrete and effective way of bringing action that will have an impact. The Pope explicitly calls for international dialogue, recognizing global interdependence, calls for the consensus needed for planning sustainable and diversified agriculture, sustainable and less polluting energy, more efficient uses of energy, better management of marine and forest resources, universal access to drinking water. All these are much bigger than national concerns. And again, the Pope says we can't ask the poor to pay for the solutions caused by the industrialized giants. Enforceable international agreements and legislation in the country in the world that has the most impact and the most ability to do something about climate change, our own nation, are so important because there are no quick solutions. Transparency is important to overcome special interests and consumption. The encyclical is is indeed comprehensive and has stimulated significant discussion and debate since its publication, but it hasn't stimulated enough action to unite the human family to the conversion necessary to preserve life as we know it. Laudato Si was written well before the current pandemic. Francis has written another encyclical, also inspired by the writings of St. Francis, entitled Fratelli Tutti, Brothers and Sisters All. It builds on the very issues contained in Laudato Si, but it laments that we didn't use the opportunity of the pandemic to draw ourselves together to overcome the virus, at least not for long. It's hard not to see the pandemic as a dress rehearsal for climate catastrophe if we don't accept this call to conversion. With all of the energy and focus on rebuilding the economy right now, yes, green energy will be included in that, it better. Are we attentive enough to the conversion that is needed for survival? Again, we don't want to be overwhelmed. Concrete action is necessary, and something that everyone can do is to be engaged in promoting legislation for carbon pricing, a fair way of placing the burden on those who are responsible, as well as offering incentives for changes to a more green economy. Thank you, and I hope I've left enough time for the questions.
Yes, thank you so much. that big vision that you reminded us of Laudato Si and beyond is so helpful. So just a reminder to folks who are listening that you can put questions into the button on the bottom of your screen that says Q&A rather than the chat. And John Keller from our Catholic Action team has been watching those questions and might possibly have a few of his own. So John, where do you want to start?
Thank you, Madeleine. Bishop Stowe, to begin, we have a relatively difficult question for you. What are your thoughts about how to reduce the politicization and social justice issues and the climate crisis in American society and the church?
Well, the one-word answer would be the very word that I was highlighting in Francis's encyclical, and that is conversion. And one of the cornerstones of Catholic social teaching is the concept of the common good. And it really requires an examination of conscience of where do I stand in this polarization. We can't just say that both sides are equally wrong and equally right. That's not going to get us anywhere. But we can each say, what am I willing to learn from the other? And what are the principles that are founded in fact, as well as founded in our tradition that we can't back down from? And who benefits? Who benefits from the division that is increasingly out there? Lots of people profit from that division. Lots of them in the media, lots of them in political parties that are promoting this kind of division only to build up their own base. The conversion that Francis is talking about, thinking as a human family, is what needs to happen.
John, if I could pause you a moment, I want to ask an additional question, Bishop Stowe. It's one of the things that I love about my own church and the church in the United States is that we span the political parties and the range of political views. Unlike some denominations, which are very much lodged in the right or the left often. And I just wonder if you have had experience of or heard of places where within the church in the United States in particular, but maybe beyond it, where people from the right and the left have been able to find common ground with each other and move forward.
Yeah, in my own diocese, one of the elements of our pastoral plan is looking at how do we relearn dialogue? How do we learn to listen to each other? Again, Pope Francis gives us a great example. When he called the bishops of the world together for a synod on the family, he gave them the instructions to listen charitably and speak boldly. And those two things are so hard to do simultaneously. But we can't have, let's find a least common denominator that we can all agree on. The planet will continue to be degraded if that's our approach. We can't say that individualized interests are just as valuable because that's somebody's opinion as the scientific data that tells us what's going on to the environment. We've seen it even with this pandemic. My individual rights being more important than the common good and the protection of a great number of people, we separate ourselves. But Pope Francis has taken on the main issue that people seem to use as the wedge issue, which is abortion, and shown how the lack of reverence for life itself and the lack of understanding of the interrelationship of all life leads to a throwaway mentality that is just as relevant to the environmental struggle as it is to the abortion issue, as it is to how we treat the elderly, and our ignorance of the poor. It's all woven together. And it's hard to see that when we're so polarized. Yeah,
thank you. I got to remember that. Listen charitably and speak boldly. Okay.
It's great. I wish I could do it.
We're all a work in progress. John, what else are you seeing in the Q&A?
Bishop Stowe, we have a good question from Carolyn in the audience. And she asks, how can we get more Catholics concerned about climate change? I never hear my parish priest talk about this subject.
And I'm sorry to hear that so frequently. Our readings come from the book of Genesis on a pretty regular basis. In the Lenten season, in the Easter season, at other times of the year, Jesus uses examples from nature all the time when he preaches his parables. The whole Easter season is about this rebirth that we celebrate in spring, and it coincides in our hemisphere with the natural cycle. So there's so many opportunities to present it. But it's a challenging issue, and I think it goes hand in hand with the preference for comfort over conversion. I think it's an easy tendency for all of us to prefer the comfortable than to what's going to challenge us. Another reason that I don't think priests preach enough about the environment is it can be overwhelming to people, and we don't want people to leave church with a guilt trip, but rather with inspiration to do something. And like recycling trash and other things that are very concrete and helpful actions just don't seem innovative enough, don't seem new enough, don't seem challenging enough to people.
Thank you. John, I think we can do one more question.
Yes, another question from the audience. Many Catholics take their lead from the Catholic Bishops' Conference. How can we get your fellow bishops to continuously include climate change and working together for a solution in the body of things that receive their attention?
If I had the answer to that, we have a different output from the conference right now. There are several of us that continue to advocate that the Pope's priorities have to be manifest in the U.S. Conference of Bishops' priorities, but it doesn't seem to get there. And unfortunately, I have to say that as a national church and the leadership of the national church, we're just as polarized as society in general. And that's a failure on the part of our teaching capacity. So I recognize the problem and am I think I'm doing my part to bring about, bring attention to these issues. And I'm glad for the organizations that are doing so much work on that. But this may be another one of those important places where the issue is going to rise up from the laity, even though it should be coming from the teachers.
Thank you for those questions, John, and for that really useful insight, Bishop Stowe. We will have to stop here and move on our agenda. I do want to thank you again for being with us, and you know, our Catholic Action Team and others of us in CCL are very interested in connecting with your fellow bishops. And if there are things that we can do to help you with that, or to help you act on that desire you mentioned to learn more about carbon pricing that you mentioned early on, we are extremely happy to help you in whatever way works for you. And thank you again.
Right. I appreciate that. Thank you. God bless you all. Have a great conference.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we are on to Danny. Yes.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for attending CCL's first ever Catholic conference, a call to action to care for our common home. My name is Dr. Danny Richter. I'm CCL's Vice President of Government Affairs and also a proud Catholic. Also relevant to this discussion, I am someone who had the extremely good fortune to attend as an observer the joint meeting in Vatican City between the Pontifical Academies of Science and of Social Science that preceded and informed the publication of Laudato Si. And what remains quite obviously to me, the pinnacle of my life, I was enjoying a meal in Casino Pio IV, home of both academies, sitting at a table with two Nobel laureates, the person who figured out how tides work and whose models the Allies used to time the D-Day invasion, the author of Merchants of Doubt, and one of the organizers of the conference at the request of the Vatican, my former professor. I had their full attention talking about what I was up to for a full minute, and that's it. That was my peak. That's as high as I've flown, even in the intervening, I guess it's 8 years now since I was there. But I find myself here at another high point in my life, for I'm very pleased to be joined by Ambassador Francis Rooney. Ambassador Rooney is the former CEO of Rooney Holdings, an investment and holding company based in Naples, Florida. He held office as the Republican representative for Florida's 19th Congressional District from 2017 to 2021. And perhaps most interesting for this audience, he was the U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See from 2005 to 2008. Welcome, Ambassador Rooney.
Thank you.
Ambassador Rooney, I think a lot of people in the audience, and I include myself in this group, have a vague idea of what the ambassador to the Holy See does. But if I'm being honest with myself, I really have no idea. And so could you please start off by sharing with us a bit of what your day-to-day looked like as an ambassador? For example, how often were you in Rome? How often were you in the United States? And who did you spend most of your time speaking to?
Yeah, for almost 3 years, we were pretty much full-time in Rome. An occasional trip back for a meeting at the White House or the State Department, but that was about it. All American ambassadors do three things. They conduct the diplomatic interchange between the host country, the Vatican in this case, and the United States. In my case, that's meeting with the Secretary of State's office and the first and second section of the Secretary of State's office. Second, we are supposed to broaden understanding and appreciation of American values, which given back then we were involved in the immigration reform fight of George Bush and Ted Kennedy and John McCain. I spent a lot of time explaining citizenship in the United States and what immigration means and all that to a European audience that was totally unaccustomed to citizenship by where you live, not by birth. And then third thing is you're supposed to take care of foreign visitors. And one great thing about the church, we have so many constituent entities in Rome with boards and benefactor groups, et cetera. We were barraged by Catholic visitors. We did things at our house 3 times a day, and it was really great. You know, the way it is in the Vatican, there's really not much work in the afternoon. All the work's in the morning. Of course, you know John Paul's great, or John the 23rd's great joke when they said, how come people don't work in the afternoon in the Vatican? He said, they don't work in the morning. They don't show up in the afternoon. But the fact is, in the afternoon, they have other things to do, mostly parochial things, research things, backing up the work that gets done in the morning. There's nobody in the Holy See's diplomatic corps that's not a 110% person. In fact, they do more with about 100 people than sometimes I think our government can do with 7,000. Tremendously great to work with.
Definitely appreciate that peek behind the curtain. And as I mentioned, I've had the good fortune to visit Vatican City, and part of what struck me was just how much of our shared history as Catholics was tied up in that one place. And I personally found it a bit overwhelming to contemplate this 2,000 years of history and to actually be there in person. And so my question for you, as a Catholic, when you consider your time as ambassador to the Vatican, what was for lack of a better word, what was the coolest thing that you found yourself getting to see or do?
Oh, well, it's no comparison. Spending time with Pope Benedict. I mean, you know, I never thought I'd meet a Pope. And then, but I spent a lot of time with Pope Benedict, and we visited regularly. And when the president came, when Mrs. Bush came, when Condi would come, et cetera, we would go see the Pope. And the first big visit I had with him, I sat down with him, and they shut this big door, and it's just me and him after all the photographs, and I couldn't.
Ambassador Rooney, I think you got on mute there accidentally.
So then he started speaking, and I said, well, I guess you get this all the time, don't you? He said, yeah, I do. He's a pretty funny guy. People said Pope Benedict didn't have a sense of humor, but he really does. And he's a great guy. And he laid the groundwork for a lot of the good work that Pope Francis is doing now with a slightly different direction, and all of which are good, in my opinion. And of course, the next best thing was working with so many brilliant members of the Holy See's diplomatic corps, led by Cardinal Taurant, who was the most brilliant of the brilliant. And I just feel very fortunate to have been able to work with them for 3 years.
That's a remarkable privilege, and thank you for sharing just a piece of that with us today. Public service has obviously been an important part of your life. And of course, after serving as ambassador, you became the representative in the U.S. Congress for Florida's 19th Congressional District. During your time in Congress, how did your faith enter into how you legislated?
Well, first of all, there are the life issues. And, you know, it was an honor and to be able to vote for pro-life issues in a fairly hostile environment sometime. I think Dan Lipinski was the only pro-life Democrat left standing. And now he's not there. The other thing was I had the opportunity to work on the environmental issues that Bishop Stowe mentioned. I think I'm one of two, both Catholic, congressmen to ever introduce a carbon tax. Carlos Curbelo from Florida while he was still in office, and then me. And I think that the carbon tax, as the bishop said, is the most logical answer to pricing carbon and removing the most hostile fuels like coal from the marketplace and driving carbon sequester and things like that will make natural gas even cleaner while we move to more renewables. And you got to be practical about it. We're going to have natural gas for a long time. We don't need coal. There's no reason to be burning all the coal we burn. So I think the carbon tax is a good solution. I'm glad that the bishop supported that. I'm also glad he mentioned plastics. I introduced a lot of bills to get global focus on the huge amount of plastics that are sitting out west of the Galapagos, most all of which come from Asia. And we should value price containers. I mean, you know, why do you have to have the white polystyrene containers that Big Macs come in? For years, Big Macs came in paper. It was just fine. When I was a kid, milk came in glass. So did soda. So there's a lot of things we could do to improve the world that are small steps. Another thing is I fought very hard against Brazil burning up the Amazon. And when you look at those dire climate change models that show Africa in areas of drought and areas of too much rain, et cetera, and can't provide for itself, that will be accelerated if we lose the carbon sink of the Amazon.
Definitely, and those are some great examples. And you did mention the carbon tax, and so I'll talk a little bit about that more. You were an original co-sponsor, and referring specifically, I believe, to the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. Although you had your name on, I think four carbon tax bills. I
introduced 3 or 4 of them. See, because I really don't care how you spend the money. I think there are good arguments on all sides of how to spend the money. But the market driver is to get the $40 to $50 per ton tax on carbon to change the market for the purchase of carbon.
And I mean, in the context of your faith as a Catholic and in the context of Laudato Si, with each of those bills that you had your name on, how do you see, connect the dots for us, how do you see Laudato Si coming out in that form of legislation? Where, connect the dots for us.
That legislation is one piece, as the bishop alluded to. There are many components to trying to remediate the world and stop the damage and stop the rising temperatures and the acid and glacial melt and all the bad things that are happening that are documentable by science. And Laudato Si did a lot of things. I mean, first of all, it put science at the forefront. It called for global action, and it focused on how the poorest of the poor are going to suffer the worst. And that's primarily Africa from the charts that I've seen. And the humanitarian crisis that could happen with migration if sub-Saharan Africa were to dry up is too hard to believe. It's really a serious problem. Similarly, in South America, should we lose the Amazon? Should the Amazon become a big clay pile of dirt like your back screen there? Can you imagine that? What we would lose in terms of carbon sink, trees, vegetables, planting, rainfall? Because if the Amazon dries up, you'll lose the rain that keeps other places wet. So those are very important. And Laudato Si was a wake-up call for that. I did have one thing I disagree with Laudato Si on. I think the Pope missed an opportunity to call out some of these corrupt and badly governed regimes who are complicit in the damage that's done to their people. Look at Nigeria. All the money that's been made in Nigeria, and it hasn't gone to any Nigerians except a very few.
Well, certainly more work to do. And I know for me, with Laudato Si, I think that I found it really freeing in a lot of ways to have a background as a scientist, to have the science brought in directly into my faith. As Bishop Stowe mentioned, that it's not that usual for an encyclical to cite scientific evidence. And so I found it as a Catholic freeing to be able to point to that encyclical and point to the science and say, these two things go together. Science can help us take care of the least among us. It can inform our policy making, and it can help us bring forth God's kingdom into this world. And so going back to your time of question, you mentioned your colleague, Dan Lipinski. Did you find that your Catholic perspective made you different from your fellow legislators? Is this something that separated you with the Catholic perspective in how you approached your work or in what you focused on?
I would say that certainly in the environmental area, the concern for humanity and the risks of migration and things that could happen if the worst cases occur were not really quite such hot topics for a lot of legislators, certainly the climate denier types. And so Laudato Si made a big impact on me in that. And I think the whole idea that we are charged as Catholics to be stewards of the earth and to leave the place better than we found it. That's part of the whole social teaching. You know, going back to rerum novarum, people need to have jobs. They need to have human dignity that comes from jobs. They need to raise their families. These are important basic human needs that our church tries to help solve.
Absolutely, yeah, and thanks for connecting it to other encyclicals, other work, other parts of our faith. I'd like to ask you to reflect a bit on where we are now, our current politics. We have a very closely divided Congress in both the House and the Senate, and we do have a president who is, from the bully pulpit, prioritizing this issue. What hope do you see in this Congress for moving forward to answering the call of Pope Francis in Laudato Si and addressing the climate crisis in particular?
I'm very optimistic with President Biden's agenda. I mean, first and foremost is putting back all of the regulations that the Obama administration put in place to clean up the way energy is produced and stored and transported. Methane rules, mercury rules, the well control rules on offshore drilling. All those things are not bad things. They're good things. And a lot of Republicans are for them, including all the major CEOs of this country and the major oil company CEOs. So it's not just a liberal Democrat deal, okay? And the more people realize that, the better. The Alliance for Market Solutions is all CEOs, and they are 100% behind those kinds of things and the carbon tax. So we need to broaden the discussion in that respect.
If you could give one piece of advice to your former colleagues on the Hill on this issue of climate, what would it be?
Read the science, read the data. I wasn't a particularly informed person about this stuff. I mean, I'd read the articles in the paper that you read about warming and acid. And as a lifelong fisherman and scuba diver, I've seen the impact of coral bleaching and rising temperatures and higher acidity in the subterranean, under the water world. And I've seen the red tide's impact on fish. So I knew a little bit, but I just decided to read the IPCC a few times, to read those different studies, to read tons of stuff from the National Bureau of Research, science research on what's happened in Florida Bay with the increasing temperatures and the changing in salinity, as all part of my environmental work to help with the Everglades. We're losing 8 feet of mangroves a year in Florida Bay. That can't keep going on forever. We're not going to have an Everglades. We're just going to have a twice as big a bay, you know. So there's all kinds of problems that science is pretty clear are happening. And anybody would have to at least admit that people have had an impact in part of that, regardless of whether it's a climate cycle or not, and it probably is. Human activity like hardscapes, like carbon, have made matters worse. If you look at the impact of permeable membranes in like shopping centers and downtown hardscapes, where the water is allowed to drain off and not have to go in a storm sewer. I mean, these are little things, but they all mount up.
They certainly do, and that was interesting hearing you read the IPCC a few times, and that's not light reading. And do you point to a particular moment of an aha moment or a moment of conversion in your reading, in your research, or was it something for you that came on gradually over time? That moment when you said, "I need to act on this." Well,
I think the science is more overwhelming than I might have thought. You know, yeah. There is just a lot of data, And even if you look at the lower trajectories, you know, they give those 4 or 5 trajectories in the IPCC and in the executive branch document. Even if you take the lower one, we still have a lot of work to do to try to contain warming. And it's going to be hard to meet the Paris goals under any circumstance. And we continue to do a lot of dumb things too. I mean, for example, ethanol doesn't help. It actually hurts. It actually remains to be seen if we're going to do more environmental damage mining lithium than we are with cars run by something cleaner than gas, like compressed natural gas. I can't tell you, I'm not a scientist, but
well, those are definitely, you've raised some really complicated issues. People who are certainly trying to do the best they can, and then we find out that even the alternative has its own impacts, and so it's a tricky situation.
But the good thing for us, we have a virtual, almost infinite supply of natural gas. We have increasingly effective technologies to make it cleaner and have less sulfur and less carbon. We can apply all that kind of stuff and take advantage of that, whether it's in a compressed natural gas vehicle or if it's just to create more electric power for electric cars and the electric devices of today. All those are good outcomes. They're better than burning coal in China. Half the coal's burned in China. Better than everywhere from northeastern France all the way through Russia burning coal. Those are real problems. It's a global problem.
Yeah, and that you do raise a good point. The cleaner burning natural gas, certainly in the past year with the pandemic layered on top of co-pollutants and the impact that has in the United States, particularly on vulnerable populations, having higher mortality due to COVID. So I think that's a really important piece to bring up.
I'm really glad you brought that up, if I might.
Sure.
The photos that have been in the media the last year and a half after basically driving and airplane flying shut down are so dramatic that I don't know how anybody can deny the impact of carbon and fossil fuels in the atmosphere. I mean, that picture that really struck me was the picture of northern India where you could see the Himalayas, probably for the first time in a couple hundred years. Or the picture of like Beijing before and after, or Denver before and after. Those were dramatic, and they basically related to gasoline and jet fuel.
Yes. Yeah, it's the particulate matter. I mean, going back to that Vatican conference, one of the things that was talked about was the particulate matter, the black carbon, and not just how it affected particularly low-income people around the world, but also how it was depositing on glaciers in the Himalayas, reducing the albedo and increasing ice melt and warming at the same time. So it is, all of these things are interrelated, certainly.
Yeah, as I understand it, there's some very dire consequences should the glaciers melt too much and start to release their carbon.
Yeah, it's we'd like to avoid that if we can. Another thing that I've observed, and this also ties in with Laudato Si, is we go back to the Pope addressed Congress at the invitation of then Speaker John Boehner.
Mm-hmm. We were there,
and that was
my wife and I were there.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, so that what I want to ask you about is, it seems to me that there has been quite a significant conversion within the Republican Party. Going from the week before that, Representative Chris Gibson introduced a resolution of only Republicans saying climate change is real, humans have had an impact, and Congress should do something about it. And at the time, that was a big deal. A week later, you have the Pope's address to Congress. That's also a big deal. And today, you have the Republican Party putting on a conference saying these are our solutions to climate at the same time that President Biden is holding his summit. It seems to me that in a relatively short amount of time, 5-6 years, the Republican Party has moved a long ways. I would say I would like to see it move further and further faster. But what are your thoughts on this? Am I just making this up, or do you think that there has been a shift over these past 5 years?
I would have to say that sometimes I don't think they've shifted enough. I mean, they're at least talking now about trees, like Bruce Westerman's "Let's plant 50,000 trees" thing that McCarthy's behind. which that's a start, okay? I think more and more of them will no longer deny the science, at least privately. They may not go out there and have a press conference about it, but at least privately, that's a start. I've made it a personal mission to bombard the leadership with polling of different voter groups on the environment. There's no issue that attracts the attention and interest of young people more than the environment. And we used to be in the fight about the environment. I mean, Nixon did the EPA, both of the Bushes expanded the Clean Air Act, had the acid rain problem, et cetera, et cetera. And now we seem to have retreated from the field, and we need to get back on the field. We can offer productive solutions like a carbon tax.
Well, that's a great segue into my next question. I mean, I think we'll get to questions from the audience pretty soon, but I know we have a lot of action-oriented people on this call. They want to help you do this. They want to help you get the Republican Party with greater ambition on climate. They're ready to go to work and move the needle. So what advice do you have for the people on this call? As Catholics, how can we help you affect legislators? How can we help Catholic legislators to act, or how do we affect just legislators in general? What can we as concerned citizens, Catholic citizens, do to help speed this along?
Well, remember that all politics is local. You've got to move the people. They will move the politicians. The politicians are basically like a waiter taking an order from the people, looking to go implement it. And we saw that we see it with the abortion issue, and we should see it here. And when Bishop Stowe lamented that a lot of parish priests don't mention this, I was thinking, well, that's where the parish council needs to say, hey, buddy, this is an important part of our social mission. Let's get out there and inform our people. And maybe they don't want to get into a big argument with their donors, who might be some of the less climate-centric Catholics in a given parish. That could well be. But it's up to them to mix it up with them. That life is not for the timid.
It is not for the timid. And as they do that, as they clarify what their order is for their server, one thing that we've always taught at CCL is that you have to approach this with appreciation and respect. Appreciation for the person you're going to meet with, of their service, of the fact that they're serving our great nation. So what is the attitude do you recommend? Is that the right pitch, or how do we?
That's a fair pitch. That's an honest. There's no reason to make an enemy that you don't have to make. Even Sun Tzu said that. But there are Republican clubs on all campuses. There are Republican clubs in all towns. Those are venues to speak, to talk about these issues. Some of those will be hostile, but that's good, because there you get the catharsis of ideas. I certainly enjoyed talking about the carbon tax to some very hostile arguments. And by the end of the day, they got it. They weren't super happy about it, but they understood the economic argument. There's also the press. Anybody can write an op-ed. And the more you write, the better. I write all the time. And I think more young people should do that. And they should write about the environment. They should write like, this is our environment. We're going to be living with it longer than a lot of other people. It's time to clean it up now. That kind of thing.
All right. Well, thank you for that guidance. And I'm looking at the Q&A. John, I see that we've got a lot of questions since I last looked at it. I see 23 in there. So, John, is there something you can bring forward for Ambassador Rooney here from the Q&A?
Yes. Ambassador Rooney, it's very inspiring to hear a well-spoken Republican like you with your concerns about climate change. CCL uses a variety of approaches to encourage Congress to support a carbon tax and climate legislation. Call-in campaigns, tweet storms, handwritten letters. What do you think are the relative effectiveness of these, and what are the best ways for any individual voter to bring this issue to greater attention with their member of Congress?
Well, I mean, there are all kinds of venues for individuals to interact with their member of Congress. And if I might, I'd like to mention something in that respect. The idea of the carbon tax interlinking with repositioning the people who were affected by their jobs may give us a new breakthrough communication tool. We're testing this out with Lisa Murkowski and Manchin and some of the people who are from coal country. That the idea is that some of the money that would be saved by the carbon tax could be deployed to counsel and retrain the workers who lose their jobs as coal goes away. Now, coal's going away anyway, and everybody knows that. But instead of taking 15 years, we could make it take 3 or 5. And why not? And why not have the energy industry pay to retrain all these workers instead of waiting 10 years and making the taxpayers do it? And Republicans like that, okay? That's a good argument.
All right, I see another one here in the chat. One thing holding back Republicans from acting is quote unquote solution aversion. If the solutions to the problem sound painful, you will deny the severity of the problem. How can we paint a more hopeful picture of the solutions to climate change?
It's a good question. You know, I know several members who are totally silent on the issue, but are not dumb, and they understand it, and they actually agree. But every time they stick their head up, the very conservative media in their district beat them over the head. So we need counter voices to be willing to speak up for them when they do stick their neck up, or to create a platform where they can at least nod and say, yeah, that I don't necessarily agree with it, but it makes sense, or something like that. You know, we've got to have incremental movement, and that's a very good question.
John, have you got another one?
Yes. From the audience, one of the questions we have relates to your time at the Vatican. And the audience member asks that about Pope Benedict, as he was known in some circles as the Green Pope for installing solar panels on buildings in the Vatican. Did you ever have a conversation with him about the climate crisis, and what were any conversations like that like?
No, to be honest, I really didn't ever talk to the Holy Father about the environment. There were so many things going on back then. Remember, this is the time when Ahmadinejad in Iran wanted to bomb Israel. This is the end of the Iraq invasion and the beginning of the Iraq morass, if you will. And we were trying to work through that with the Holy See. We had the whole rise of Islamic fanaticism that Pope Benedict was a very leading person on, as you know, and he has a great understanding of the whole interfaith environment, especially Islam. We used to talk about the Quran a lot, and so those were really front burner issues for the United States and the Holy See back then.
Danny, I think you're on mute.
Thank you for that. We have another question from the audience. Ambassador Rooney, do you find there is a connection between your pro-life advocacy and your advocacy for climate action? And if so, could you talk a little bit about that? That's
a really good question. That's kind of what the bishop was referring to, that you can't be pro-life in one way and not be pro-life in other ways. And the number of people who are going to have their life threatened and they're severely threatened by the radical climate change over the next 40 or 50 years is quite disheartening. And most of it takes place in Africa, some in South America. So again, the poorest of the poor get hurt the worst. And that's something that we're supposed to be dedicated to try to deal with.
And John, I think we have time for one more. Do you have one last question for Ambassador Rooney?
Yes, one final question to wrap up relates to Florida itself. Is there any action being taken in Florida or by government bodies in Florida to work on climate change on the state level, as we see in some other states?
You know, by and large, Florida is a great place to be pro-environment, because no matter how conservative people may be on other kinds of issues, most people down here are very sensitive to the environment, because that's why they're here. They're here for the external environment, being outside, being at the beach. They care about estuaries. They care about the pollution in the Caloosahatchee and the Everglades. They care about the risk of bigger storms. And so the more we can inform them about like the rise in the heat content due to global warming, the connection of that to bigger hurricanes and things, I think would be an important thing to do. And Ron DeSantis, very conservative governor, been very pro-environmental. He's done everything he said he would do. I work closely with him in Congress to deal with the estuaries and the Everglades National Park and the pollution in Lake Okeechobee. He's always been very supportive.
All right. Ambassador Rooney, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for your leadership while you were in Congress. I know that you're a hero to a lot of CCLers for your support of carbon taxes. And thank you for taking time out of your Saturday to be here with us and share with us some of your experience, your wisdom, and your perspective as a Catholic. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Keep up the good work. It's individuals that make the difference.
We've got a lot of motivated individuals here. I'm sure they'll keep on acting. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.